We're talking today with Carleton Brown of Grand Rapids, Michigan, and the interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. Okay, Carl, start us off with some background, and to begin with, where and when were you born?
I was born in New Haven, Connecticut. My dad was in the Navy. He was in medical school at Yale, and so I started out being in the Navy when I was born, actually.
Okay. And what year were you born?
1944.
Okay.
October 28, 1944.
All right. Now, did your father have a career in the Navy?
He did. He was he went to medical school and he became a flight surgeon, and I think he had at least 30 years in before he retired.
Okay, so that means that as a Navy kid or Navy brat,
Navy
you would
brat.
have moved around a lot.
We moved around a lot. I went to 13 schools before I graduated from high school.
All right, and tell me a little bit about your high school education. Where did you go to high school? Where did you graduate from?
Ninth grade was in Beaufort, South Carolina. 10th grade, they sent me to St. Peter's Episcopal School for Boys in Peekskill, New York. 135 spoiled brats and me.
Mm-hmm.
That was a lot of fun. And then 11th grade was at Terry Parker High School in Arlington, near Jacksonville, Florida. And then Manchester High School Central in Manchester, New Hampshire is where I graduated from high school.
Okay. Now, were all of these switches based on your father moving around, or were there other reasons for you to go to the...
A large part of it, okay. Plus getting a better, maybe the school system in Jacksonville wasn't very good, and they was facing disaccreditation.
Mm-hmm.
And so they sent me to New Hampshire to graduate from a school in New Hampshire.
Okay. And why New Hampshire?
Well, my grandparents lived in Manchester, New Hampshire, and I had gone to school in the first grade in Manchester, New Hampshire. My dad was stationed in Turkey, and my mother was homeschooling me,
mm-hmm.
and that wasn't really working out in the first grade. So they put me on a plane, and I flew to Manchester, New Hampshire, and started first grade at Pearl Street Elementary School in Manchester.
All right. Now, you also had a stint in San Diego when you were a kid, right?
I never really lived in San Diego. We lived in Hawaii.
Hawaii, rather.
For a
that
while.
was what I'm asking. Yes.
Yeah. My dad was stationed at Hickam, and I met my wife. We were kids at the housing area just north of Hickam, and I went to her 9th birthday party, and kind of kept track of her through my mom and her mom. Oddly enough, her name was Brown then, before we were married, and so she just continued on with the same name, Brown. And she often complains that she was looking for a more interesting last name, but got stuck with Brown again.
At least people can spell it.
That's right.
So
that's right. I always say, when they ask me what my last name is, I say Brown, like the color.
All right. Okay. So you wind up graduating from high school then in Manchester, New Hampshire. In what year?
That would have been in 1963, I believe.
Okay.
62 or 63.
Let's see. Well, okay. And then from there, where did you go to college?
I went to the University of Florida.
Okay. And how did you wind up going there?
Well, I wanted to go to a New England school, but I didn't really have the education that would allow me to do that. So I did well on the SATs and applied to the University of Florida, where I had some friends going to school,
mm-hmm.
and they took me. And
okay. And when you got to Florida, what did you major in?
Well, the first couple of years, you kind of like are looking for a major.
Right.
I tried the pre-med route and so forth and so on, but I wound up in journalism and communications.
Okay.
As my graduate degree, as my undergrad degree.
All right. And then while you're in school, so if you're there, by the time you're getting close to graduating, the draft is ramping up and Vietnam
yes.
is starting.
Oh, I was safe. I was 2S. No fears of the draft.
Okay, and 2S, what does that stand for?
Well, it means you have a deferment.
You have
as
a student deferment.
Right.
Okay. All right. And all right. So how do you wind up in the service?
Well, I on my way back to the fraternity house, I stopped at they had a booth where they were looking for pilots, Navy pilots, and I went up to the guys there and said I'd be interested in being a pilot in the Navy, and I have really thick glasses, so obviously that wasn't going to work out. And he told me, well, I don't think you're going to be a pilot, but you can go to the student union and take a test. So I took a test at the student union, and then kind of forgot about it. A couple weeks later, I was on my way back to the fraternity house, and when I walked in, somebody said, "Hey, Brown, you're going to Vietnam. Grab your rifle and get on the bus." I said, "Wait a minute, what's going on?" And they had opened my letter and put it on the bulletin board that I was heading off to war. And so I was a little bit concerned about that. But I had to go and have a physical and all of that.
Okay. Now, were you at that point in your 4th year of college?
Yeah, about into the 4th year, well
Okay.
into the 4th year.
Because with a student deferment normally lasts for 4 years. So it may be that the draft board was just all ready to
Yeah,
get you.
changing majors a few times. I think I was actually a student at the University of Florida for almost 5.5
Okay.
years.
That would do it.
Yep,
Once you
that
get
kind
there.
of pushed the edge there. So anyway, I found out that I did well on that test I had taken, and the guy said, the recruiters, that since I had taken the test before I got the letter, if I wanted to, I could enlist in the Navy and perhaps go to OCS. So that's the route I took.
Okay, that's Officer Candidate School.
Right.
You have to remember our audience doesn't necessarily know all the
Sorry-
acronyms.
Sorry
That's
about
okay?
that. Yeah.
All right. Okay. So you then approached was there a Navy recruiter on campus, or what do you do?
I think I made a phone call and set up a meeting to go talk to him. And he knew that I had gotten a score on the test that allowed me to perhaps go that route for enlistment instead of going to Vietnam with a draft notice. So
Okay. And does the timing of the test matter? When you took it?
yeah, I had to have taken the test before I got my draft notice.
Okay. So what year was this when this first happened?
It was in 1966.
Okay. So at 66, you have a lot of people who get draft notices and expect to go into the Army or something, and they'll try to get into the Navy or the Air Force. So you had a lot of people trying to enlist at that point.
I'm sure.
And so that would probably affect why they would pay attention to that kind of thing.
That's right.
But anyway, you had done it right. And so
I was fortunate.
Okay. Now, did they let you finish your
Yeah,
degree first?
I got to finish my studies and get my degree, and then April of that next year, I went to Officer Candidate School in Newport, Rhode Island.
All right. Now, were you married or engaged yet, or does that come later in the story?
Not married at that point, not really thinking about it very much. Went to OCS, took about 4 months, and then I went to communication school for a couple of months, and then got my little MGB and headed for California.
All right. We'll back up a little bit.
Okay, sure.
Talk about OCS. What did that actually consist of?
Well, OCS was very interesting, and there were 11 of us in our section, and we got to be pretty good buddies. You learned how to eat the Navy way, which is really fast, as much as you could get in your mouth at a time, and then off you move. It was the first month or two was move, move, move. We really push you along and go through the stuff, go to classes, march, a lot of marching, and I was very interested in learning more about the Navy. I'd kind of been in the Navy all my life with my dad and different bases, and he taught me a lot of very interesting things about how to do well in the Navy. I think probably the main one was he taught me that chiefs were in charge of the Navy, and if you wanted to get along or do well in the Navy, you had to remember that the chiefs were in charge.
Okay, the chiefs being chief petty officers.
Chief petty officers.
The non-commissioned officers.
That's
yeah.
right. And I always kept that in my mind, and it served me well.
Okay. How much spit and polish was there in the OCS?
There was a lot of spit and polish. You had to keep your boonies really well shined. I was the only one in our group that knew how to spit shine a boonie, so I had to teach the other guys how to do that.
What is a boonie?
Boonies are your boots. They're not real high boots, but they become your best friends. And your pea coat, you had to have a nice warm pea coat.
Okay, so you knew how to spit shine and
That's right. I had to show them how. It takes a little bit of time and patience to get that shine that when you look at it, it looks like a mirror finish.
All right. And then what do the classes consist of?
Well, we had different classes in like tactics and seamanship, navigation, a lot of the different things that you would run into when you got aboard a ship. We had to, there were yard patrol craft that we went out and sailed around on, I guess that's Narragansett Bay, and learned some things about Navy procedures and communications, and that was it was a really full 4 months of that kind of activity.
Okay. Now, one thing that you mentioned before we started the session was that your OCS class was kind of unusually small.
Right.
And so how does that affect the dynamic of those 4 months? If you're this small and other classes are larger?
Well, there's a lot of things that have to get done in terms of like cleaning up things and putting things in different places. And so the class ahead of you, when you come in, they kind of like use you to do all of that. And the class ahead of us was like over 100 men, and we were only 11, so we got worn pretty thin. But by the time we graduated, the class behind us was quite large, so we had a lot of resources and assets. And it's, even though it's only a month, it seems like a long time.
Right. Okay. All right. So when did you finish the OCS part?
That would have been in July of '67.
Okay. All right. And then the next step was?
Communication school.
Okay. Was that in Newport or
that
somewhere
was in
else?
Newport.
Okay.
So it was just a hop, skip, and a jump from our OCS spaces there.
Okay. And so what are you actually being taught in communication school?
Well, they teach us some of the basics about naval communications, including cryptography and things like that. Have they call it a Romeo 8, which has little disks and spin, and so you can decrypt and encrypt messages and those kinds of things. Plus the basic stuff like semaphore and the Navy, when you talk with radio telephone procedures, how to use proper radio telephone procedure techniques, spelling like Alpha, Bravo, Charlie letters and things like that.
All right. Now, was communications going to be your specialization, or?
Looked like it,
Okay.
yep, at that point.
All right. And then how long did that school last?
It was a couple of months.
Okay. Now, when you're in that school, or an OCS for that matter, do you get much of a chance to go off base, or do you just stay on the base the whole time?
Yeah, you can get off base. There's you get some OCS, of course, after you're in for a little while, maybe about a month, maybe 3 weeks to a month, then you can get off on the weekends. And at comm school, it was just during the days. And there was a flag football team and things like that.
Okay. And would you go into Newport and?
Washington Square.
Okay. And how did the people in the community treat the Navy people?
I didn't interface with a lot of civilians in the community, but it didn't seem like there was any problem with that.
Okay.
I think it's likely that the OCS and all the Navy stuff is probably a pretty good industry for that community.
Okay, so there weren't signs on the lawn saying no sailors allowed, and they
No,
not like Norfolk or someplace like that, were there?
I didn't see any signs
Okay,
against the military.
all right. That's curious there. Now, would you go into Boston, or would you just stay around Newport?
I went into Boston a few times. I had friends in New Hampshire, so we got up into New Hampshire. Sometimes my OCS buddies would go with me, or we'd go to maybe University of Connecticut for a football game, or up into Manchester and meet up with my grandparents. And
Okay.
so there was
All right.
some time like that.
Okay. And when you finish communication school, then what's the next step from there?
Then I got orders to an aircraft carrier in California, and I had a little bit of time off, spent some time with my parents in Florida, and then drove to California.
Okay. Now, had you received your commission yet, or does that come after you get out to California?
You get your commission after OCS
Okay.
and before comm school. So I was a red hot ensign by then.
All right. Okay. And so now you're at Yorktown aircraft carrier.
Right.
All right. So how are you treated when you get there, and what happens when you arrive at the ship?
Well, I found out where to go, and they told me where to put my stuff. They weren't paying a lot of attention to me at that point because they were getting ready for an extended tour to Vietnam, and so everybody was kind of preparing for that. We did have some conferences we had to go to and things to get ready for the journey, and one of the things they had to do was talk about radio telephone procedures, oddly enough. And since I had just graduated from communication school, they said, okay, well, you're in charge. We want you to conduct the radio telephone. So I had to try and teach all these guys that knew a whole lot more than me about radio telephone procedures what the proper techniques were. Like, for instance, you don't say, Roger Wilco over and out. That's not right. But that's what everybody says. Things like that. And so we did that in San Diego, and everybody was pretty happy with knowing what the rules were, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to use them.
All right. So how long did you spend in port before you went out?
Well, I got there in real early December, 1967, and I went. I needed to get my clothes cleaned and get going, so I looked up my mom. I called my mother, and she gave me her friend's number in Newport Beach that I had known when I was a child, when I was a kid. So I called her, and she said, come on down, and I went down there, and after she fed me a couple times and cleaned my clothes, I said, didn't you have a daughter about my age? And so she gave me Betsy's address, my wife-to-be, and I drove up to Westwood in L.A. and knocked on her apartment door, and her roommate, Judy, answered, and I said, well, Judy, is Betsy here? And Judy said, no, there's no Betsy here. And then she turned and said, Betty, do you know a Betsy? I said, oh wait, maybe it's Betty I'm looking for. And so Betty came, and unfortunately Betsy had a date that night, and but I took Judy out and learned a little bit about. And then I made a date with Betsy for the following weekend. So that was in about the middle of December, and then anyway, we had a strong relationship, and I proposed to her, and Christmas Eve I asked her father for his daughter's hand in marriage, and then the ship left before New Year's for 8 months.
Okay.
So that was a fast month. I can't believe it all happened in 1 month.
Well, I know you're about the age where sometimes things can move that fast.
That's right. That's right.
And it seems to have worked because she's listening in from the booth right now. So, okay. All right. So now you ship out when you cross. So did you just go straight across the Pacific, or did you put in any ports along the way?
Well, we had an interesting time. When we went out, the ship goes down to San Diego, and the aircraft come aboard, and then we go out, and it just turns out that we were following the Enterprise across, and there was a Soviet attack submarine that was shadowing the Enterprise, and we were allowed to use our anti-submarine warfare technology that was pretty sophisticated at the time to try and track that submarine as it was watching the Enterprise. So the aircraft would go out and drop sonobuoys and patterns, and we would try and locate the submarine, and sometimes we could and sometimes we couldn't. But it was the first time that they let us overtly prosecute to try and find that submarine. And the Enterprise went into Pearl before we did, and then we were in Pearl for a while, and then she left before we did, and we did some more of that on the way out to Japan. And it was pretty exciting because the whole progress of all of that is done in what they call the Flag Operations Center, which is right next to the CIC, Combat Information Center. Combat is dark, but the Flag Operations Center is lit. So pilots come through and they had these big boards that they move back and forth with all the little planes and everything, and move them around and to try and give the pilots some idea where they should go to try and find the submarine and track it down. So it was really very interesting for me. It was my first real experience in the Navy doing anything like that, and it was quite an adventure.
Mm-hmm.
And then when we got to on our way to Japan, the North Koreans took the Pueblo, and then we got diverted up into the Sea of Japan, and we were part of the operation that was watching Wonsan Harbor and deciding what to do about the fact that the Pueblo had been captured.
Mm-hmm.
And my boss was a communications guy, and he set up these special circuits, and we got messages about that, like contingency plans.
Mm-hmm.
And I pulled those. They were top secret plans that, you know, you had to have a disclosure sheet on top before you looked at. After you looked at them, you had to sign the disclosure sheet saying that you had access to these things. And so they came in, and I put them on the board and took them to the chief of staff. And he asked me, well, what are those messages? And I said, well, they're contingency plans. He said, well, I don't want to read them. Go show them to the Admiral. So I took them to the Admiral, and I said, these are the contingency plans. The chief of staff said I should bring them to you. And he said, what is it? I said, well, it's what we're going to do in case there's, you know, we want to do something with the Pueblo and all. And he said, well, I don't want to read that stuff. Go take it to somebody else. So I went around trying to get somebody else to read these contingency plans, which included maybe some things that the Yorktown would be doing in that contingency, and nobody read it. And so I put it in the safe and locked it away and hoped that nothing ever happened where we'd need those things. And it was kind of stressful because I was the only guy that read those things. Mm-hmm. And, you know, anything could happen.
Yeah. But as it was, that situation did get defused, so we didn't invade North Korea or anything like that.
That's right. That's right. But I think they made the Pueblo into a museum.
Yeah, yeah.
And maybe if we get a little more peaceful with North Korea, we'll be able to go and check out that museum someday.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. So you go to Japan. Do you go on shore in Japan, or you just stay on the ship?
Yeah, we went to Yokosuka and did some shore leave there, a little bit of time. And then the Yorktown had a problem with its prop, and they took it down to Sasebo and put it in dry dock and changed the prop out. And so we got to see Sasebo, which is an interesting town, southern Japan. Mm-hmm. Very different than Tokyo, that's for sure.
Okay. How did the Japanese people seem to view the American sailors? Or
pretty positively. You know, we had good liberty in Japan.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody was pretty happy with Americans.
So you didn't have too many seamen acting up in the bars or anything like that?
Not too much, no.
Okay.
Most of that was in the Philippines, I guess.
All right, yeah, it's a different world. Okay.
Different world.
So from Japan now, do you head to the coast of Vietnam, or what comes next?
Right. We went to the Philippines, Olongapo, and then over to Yankee Station.
Okay.
Now explain
what Yankee Station was.
Well, the Yankee Station is really just kind of an area near Hanoi, outside of Hanoi and Haiphong, where a lot of the action was taking place in terms of U.S. planes bombing Haiphong and Hanoi, and that was where the serious war was.
Okay, and so now this is 1968 now that this is happening.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and this is the period of, the Tet Offensive started January 30th, and the fighting really goes on, or high intense levels of fighting go on for about a year after that.
Yes.
So there's a lot of action going on, both in South Vietnam and bombing raids against the North. Now, so was the Yankee Station area kind of in international waters? So they.
I believe it was.
Mm-hmm.
There was always the threat of submarines there, even though it's not very deep. We still worried about that possibility coming into play. So our job on the Yorktown was to keep track of all the surface combatants and to be sure to be ready to react to any kind of submarine activity that might have been come in. But I don't think there ever was. To my knowledge, there wasn't any submarine activity.
Okay. Now, would planes from the Yorktown go and hit targets on the mainland, or?
No, they mainly monitored combatants, surface combatants, and checked for submarines. They were always doing anti-submarine, and they had equipment on the Yorktown, that sonar equipment and that kind of equipment. Plus, we delivered the mail. It was probably the good thing that we did was keep the mail going. So the mail came into the Yorktown, and then planes, carrier, CODs, we call them CODs. I don't remember what that stands for, but they would deliver the mail out to others, and there were underway replenishments, and destroyers would come alongside, and things would be transferred and replenished.
Okay, so you're doing what is essentially, you have screening duties or whatever, or
Screening.
escort duties, and other carriers are the ones that have the strike forces.
That's right.
All right, but then you fill these other kinds of jobs and duties because you've got a big ship that can hold a lot of stuff.
That's
and
right.
Planes can land
That's
there
right.
and take
And
off.
the Yorktown was a CVS, not a CVA. So that little distinction put her into more of a anti-submarine role.
Okay.
And I was aboard the Yorktown when she had her 25th birthday. I took a picture of the men out on the deck, 25 years, and Hilo went around and took pictures, and it was a big day for the Yorktown, which saw service in World War II.
Yeah, because it was a replacement for the original one that was lost at Midway.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Now, so what was daily life like for you on the Yorktown?
It was fairly routine. I mean, I had a room with two other guys, and showers were always a little bit tough. You could only, if you took more than a 10-second shower, the water they always had a problem getting enough fresh water. But the food was pretty good. They used to say about the Yorktown that she wasn't a looker, but she was a feeder. So we got pretty good grub on the Yorktown. I never complained, and I never got seasick, so that was good.
All right. Now, and then your duty station
Was in the Flag Operations Center, and they had a watch section. You have like 4 hours of watch, and then they had a routine, and different people would come in and go off, and you'd have to show them what was going on and bring them up to date, and then the next crew would come in. I stood watch. There were 2 officers that stood watch in the Flag Operations Center.
And how many enlisted did you have with you?
There's probably a good 50 enlisted men connected with the staff and its operation.
All right. And then did you, you talked before about how the chiefs run the show.
Yes.
How did you apply that knowledge when you went into your assignment there?
Well, as an ensign and a JG, not so much, but I still paid attention, because it's pretty obvious if you watch what's going on that chiefs are running things in the Navy.
Okay. Because I guess at that point you're not giving orders normally. There would be
Not
somebody
really.
superior to you on duty with you.
Right.
And so you have particular jobs and things that you do.
That's right.
All right. Okay. Now, did anything kind of about how long did you spend off of the coast of Vietnam?
Well, several weeks from time to time, and then we would go back to the Philippines.
Okay.
We did take a tour. We got around to Singapore once, and that was an interesting trip. Got off the ship enough to get into looking at Malaysia a bit. It was an interesting country, and the people were happy to see us. Went to there's a fancy hotel there in Singapore. I can't remember the name of it, but anyway, so we did see some sights there, and then back online.
Okay. Now, when you would go into a port, did officers take turns with shore patrol, or was that all enlisted men?
Pretty much enlisted men did shore patrol.
Okay. So that wasn't part of what you had to do, was
No.
go out and look for that?
No.
Okay. Now, were there, aside from the Pueblo incident, were there any other things that happened that kind of stood out in your experience there or took you out of the routine?
On that tour, not really. The following tour on the Kearsarge was really much the same. Still same kind of operations, anti-submarine warfare operations. But then we got into an exercise, a CETO exercise, which included ships from the Philippines and Japan and
So that's
a lot of other
Southeast
countries.
Asia Treaty Organization.
Southeast Asia Treaty Organization in the South China Sea. And it was during that exercise that I was on duty. I was on watch, mid-watch. It's about 1:30 in the morning. And one of our destroyers, the destroyer that went across with us, part of our carrier group, was in this exercise with the Melbourne, which was an Australian aircraft carrier. And during the night, they went into plane operations, which was a normal thing. And the Frankie Evans was the destroyer working with the Melbourne. The Frankie Evans was forward of the Melbourne in a screen position. And the Melbourne asked her to take plane guard duty, which is a very normal thing, because when you're conducting operations, aircraft operations, you want to have a destroyer close behind you in case a plane goes in the water, because the destroyer can get to that plane a lot faster than the carrier could possibly turn around and get to them. So taking plane guard is a normal safety precaution. But the skipper of the Evans didn't handle the ship properly, and when he came around, the Melbourne cut it in two. And 65 guys on the bow of that ship went down within about 5 minutes. And it's pretty deep there. It's the Marianas Trench.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a real bad accident. And I was in the Flag Operations Center, and I heard somebody in CIC laughing. And I thought, well, what's going on? You know, and I opened the curtain, and the guy pulled the message off the teletype and says, "Look, Mr. Brown, it says here the Evans is in two parts." I said, "What could that mean?" He said, "I don't know." Well, it turned out that there had been a collision at sea, and in about 5 minutes, the Flag Operations Center was full of officers. Really, that was a bad event. And I remember the next day, I was on watch for about 7.5 hours before I went out. And then when I got out, I went out on the flight deck, and the Evans was about 1,000 yards off, and you could see where it had been the front half had been cut off. It looked just like somebody took a pair of scissors and cut that ship in half.
Okay, but the main part of the ship was still afloat otherwise.
The stern half was still afloat.
Okay, so it was just designed so that it could do that kind of thing?
I guess they had pretty good watertight integrity, and they kept the hatches locked, and she stayed afloat, the stern half. There were some strange stories. One seaman who was asleep in the superstructure landed on the deck of the Melbourne when the accident occurred. He woke up and he had no idea where he was. And the crew from the shipmates, the men on the Melbourne did a remarkable job rescuing people in the water and reacting right away to try and save as many people as they could.
Okay. So some of the people on the bow or in that section wound up in the water rather than going down with the piece of the ship.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Now, that's jumped a little bit ahead in your story here. So we kind of would go back. Okay. So you have so you do your Yankee Station patrol with the Yorktown, and then does the Yorktown after a certain number of months go all the way back to the States? Or
goes back to San Diego, back to Long Beach. We got back to Long Beach in July, and in August, I had a wedding with
Mm-hmm.
my wife, Betsy, August 10th, and then we went on a little honeymoon, and that was so it was a long 8-month engagement,
Mm-hmm.
but most of that was when I was
You were on a
on
ship. Well, out of trouble anyway.
But we wrote to each other every day.
Okay. All right. So being on the mail ship was a good
A
thing
little
at that
blessing,
point.
right?
Okay. So now normally when a ship comes back to port, would you have an extended period back in the States before going out again?
Yeah, if you're on the ship's crew,
Mm-hmm.
you know, it'd probably be a couple years before you would your ship would be deployed back to
Okay.
Vietnam or somewhere else on an extended time frame. But I was on this Admiral Staff, and you get about 4 months, and then they put you on a different ship. You get on a different ship, this time the Kearsarge,
Mm-hmm.
CVS 33, and then back to Vietnam, back to deployment.
Okay. Now, were you assigned to the Admiral Staff after you got back on the Yorktown, or were you already attached to that
Same
Admiral?
Admiral Staff. It just moves from one ship. They move their flag from one ship
Okay.
to another. Mm-hmm.
All right. And can you name which admiral that was?
On the Yorktown, Admiral Weymouth was our admiral,
Okay.
and he was a very distinguished admiral, fighter pilot in World War II, I guess. Sure. And then Admiral Jerome H. King took over as commander ASW Group 1
Mm-hmm.
when we were on the Kearsarge.
Okay. All right. So basically, you're with the unit, but on the admiral's staff, essentially, and so
Right.
the admiral switches, but the staff stays the same.
That's right.
Okay. All right.
And
So-
there's some other staff members, but
Yeah.
for the most part, we stayed the same.
okay. Now, at this point, I mean, have you been promoted yet? Are you a lieutenant junior grade, or?
I made lieutenant junior grade. You had to be in an ensign for a year at
Mhm.
that point, and then if everything went well, you got promoted to JG,
Okay.
junior grade.
All right. And did you get that promotion before you left?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Yes.
Because you've got a picture of your wife helping pin the bars on.
That's
there,
right.
so
That's right.
You got that. Okay. Now, with the Kearsarge, was this essentially a repeat of the same kind of thing you were doing on the Yorktown?
Very similar. Yes.
Okay. And then, aside from the incident
With
with
the
the ship,
Evans.
the
Mhm.
Evans, what other things kind of stand out for you from that tour?
You know, nothing really stood out. It was a lot of watch standing and making sure that everybody knew what was going on in terms of what ships were where, and the pilots would come through and we would show them the best scenarios we could about what was going on in the surface activity and if there were any submarine activity.
Okay. And now, did the Soviets or Chinese or anybody else shadow you at all, or have their own boats out there? I mean, there were Soviet trawlers and things that we hear about.
I remember we got overflown by bears at one point. That was kind of exciting because when the Russian bombers come by, they come in, they get really close. I mean, you can even see. I had this imagination that I could see people on those planes.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's an amazing thing that they would come by that close. And I think they're kind of trying to scare you a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so aircraft, but not necessarily any other vessels that you can remember.
No, I don't recall any collisions at sea or anything like that.
Okay.
From there, sometimes when you're going through the harbors, you know, you have to be careful of the junks because there's a lot of maneuvering you have to do to get around smaller boats and ships in and out of harbors. That's about it.
Okay. Now, with these carriers, did you ever put into Cam Bay or Vietnamese port, or always
No.
other places? Yeah.
Nope. Carriers didn't go in there.
Okay. And then you said you got to Singapore. Did you go Hong Kong or Taiwan or
Yeah,
anywhere?
we went to Hong Kong. We took a trip to Hong Kong, and that was very interesting. We went all the way up to where Red China started.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a little gate there.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Some people tell stories about going into the harbor at Hong Kong and having a bunch of women coming out and painting their ship. Now, was that for smaller boats? Probably not an aircraft carrier.
I guess so. I guess so.
But you didn't see anything like that you recall from?
No, I don't recall.
Okay.
It did seem like there was some commerce going on though
Mm-hmm.
between boats in the harbor and some of the ships. There were really probably groceries and vegetables, and
Mm-hmm.
it was always nice to get some fresh vegetables.
Right. Okay. Now, when you go into a port like that, do you get any information in terms of what you should do and don't do, or any miscellaneous warnings, or?
Oh yeah, there's a list of what do they call it? I can't remember what they call it, but places that they don't recommend that you visit,
Mm-hmm.
which are usually the best places. That's you kind of look forward to getting that list because you can find out where the action is.
All right. Well, I mean, there's the kinds of places where you can get yourself into a lot of trouble,
Right.
as opposed to the kinds of places that are nice and expensive and fancy, and they don't want a bunch of drunken Americans running around.
Right.
Okay. So would your list include both kinds of things, or what did they emphasize?
They emphasize the first, where you're
Okay.
these are dangerous spots. Not recommended.
Okay. And you also talked about going to the Philippines. How is going to the Philippines different from going to a Hong Kong or a Singapore?
Well, Philippines, of course, they had a really good Navy exchange. It was a place to go to buy a tape recorder,
Mm-hmm.
a Sony tape recorder, things like that. It's not as clean a place
Mm-hmm.
as Hong Kong, so you have to be a little careful about what you get involved in and where you go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've had interesting stories from enlisted men about going.
Longapo
Yep.
was an interesting place. They had there's a bridge from between the base and you get into a Longapo. There's a bridge, and there are boats in the water, and sometimes there's attractive young ladies on the boats, and people would like throw money in the water, and they would dive down in to get the money. And it was all kind of a kind of a circus thing.
Mm-hmm. All right. Okay. So how long was the tour on the Kearsarge?
Well, it would have been another 8-month tour, but I requested some other duty,
Mm-hmm.
and I got that extra duty. I felt like maybe I could see some of the rest of the world, rather than what looked like to me was that I was going to be on the Kearsarge for another 8 months, and then the staff would move to another carrier, and we'd go back. And so my 3 years in the Navy would include three tours to Vietnam, and that seemed like a bit much to me.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought one of the things that I was responsible for was the registered documents. It's called a RPS custodian. So I'd have to go with a bag and get new key lists and things, and then turn in the old key lists and do all of that for the registered publications, which were classified, sensitive information. So I was at the center once, and I asked him, where are all these registered publication places? And he said, well, they're all over the world. They're in Scotland and Germany and Spain. I said, well, that sounds like a pretty interesting thing. I'd like to get involved in that, and we could see some of the rest of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went back and I looked up the instruction. I thought, maybe I'll just put in for a tour of duty with the security group, because the Naval Security Group are the ones that handle all of that. So then I thought, well, what do I offer? What do I have to offer the security group? I really don't have anything. Maybe if I spoke Russian, that would be something that they need, based on my reading. So I put in for a Russian language school, and sure enough, I got orders to Russian language school, and then a tour of duty with the security group, which is odd because usually things don't go the way you plan them. So my wife and I went to the Presidio of Monterey. The Presidio is an Army language school.
Mm-hmm.
We took Russian for a year, and she did better than I did. She was a very good student, but we would have these sessions where you would do a conversation in Russian, and we would practice doing them with each other, and so we got pretty good at Russian.
So how did she wind up in the Russian language school?
Well, if they had room, you could ask for your wife to go, and
Okay.
there was enough room for her to go.
Okay. Now, did she, did you have some kind of security clearance yourself for the duty that you had? Or was that
Yes.
required? Okay.
Yes.
And was she required to have a security clearance of
No,
some
she
kind?
wasn't. She
Okay.
wasn't. Fortunately, she didn't have to have a security clearance to learn Russian.
Right.
So,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So she's there. So she's helping you along with
Yes.
with the Russian.
Yes.
Now, did they just use immersion, or how do they teach you Russian
It's
quickly?
immersion. They had wonderful instructors. Most of these instructors, many of the instructors were older and had gotten out of Russia before the revolution. So they're pretty old, but very, very American people, very pro-American, and they're interesting to have as instructors. And they had all kinds of interesting stories to tell about living in Russia with the Tsar before communism, and so that was a very interesting experience. And part of learning Russian, they take you through Russian history, which has got to be one of the toughest things to try and learn, especially if you're learning it in Russian, is a kind of an ordeal, because America's been around for what, 300 years, and Russian history goes for thousands of years. It's just a crazy thing.
Yeah, I did a
Long.
field in grad school. So
Did
yes,
you?
Yeah, very interesting stuff too.
Very interesting stuff.
Okay. All right. So how long was the language school? You said that was a
That
year?
was a year.
That was a year. Okay. Now, how much time do you have left in your enlistment at this point?
Well, when you take these schools, you get more time. You have to
Okay.
commit to more time.
So you would have been in 4 years, but now it's going to be 5 and something? Or?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
All right. So you spend a year there, and then do you live on the base? Do they have facilities
At
for
Fort
you?
Ord
Yeah.
in California, yep,
Okay.
they had facilities.
And so what were those like?
They was pretty nice. It was a little like a duplex, and it was furnished with Army furniture, and it was comfortable enough.
Okay.
And one of the things you really had to do was keep everything very clean. They liked it to be very clean. It was clean when you got it. By golly, it had to be really clean when you left.
Right. Now, you were able to afford having your wife be in school rather than working someplace?
Yeah, the expenses weren't great at that point because you got your housing provided,
Right.
and so we were fortunate in that respect.
Okay. All right. So after you complete your year of language school, now what assignment do you get?
Well, I put in for Scotland, Edzell, Scotland, and we had a couple there in Edzell that were our sponsors, and we wrote letters back and forth, and we were all excited about moving to Scotland. But then 2 weeks before we were set to go, my orders changed, and they decided to send us to Bremerhaven, Germany instead. And we were really disappointed, Gee, I thought Scotland was going to be a lot of fun. So we went to Bremerhaven, Germany, and that was nice. We had a nice place. My son was born just before we went to Germany, and then while we were in Germany, my wife decided to have twins.
Okay.
So we had 3 young children there, and Bremerhaven was a good place to have your kids. And I was doing watches. I was doing 8-hour watches. After we were there for about 6 months, I thought maybe it'd be nice to go visit the people that we were gonna live with over in Scotland. So we wrote to them, and they said, "Come on over," and we put the car on the ferry and went to Harwich and drove up to Edsall, Scotland, and met them, and it was pretty remote.
Mm-hmm.
It was really remote, and drove back to Germany, and I think we were both pretty thankful that we got sent to Bremerhaven instead.
Because Bremerhaven is a good-sized port city, and you're
Yes.
close to Hamburg. and
Close to
places like-
Hamburg and Bremen.
Mhm.
We went to Bremen a few times, get on the train and go to
Yep.
Bremen. And I was standing watches. We had like 6 8-hour watches in about 4, I can't remember the math on, about 4.5 days. So you did your watches, and then you got like 3.5 days off. So Betsy we'd got a babysitter, and we'd load up the car, and I'd meet her at the end of the watch, and we would drive to Amsterdam or Vienna, or made different trips out of that. We didn't do that every time, but once in a while. Stockholm
Mm-hmm.
in Sweden, and then so we have like 3 days off, and then back to work.
Mm-hmm.
So we saw a little bit of Europe doing that.
Okay. Now, when you would travel around Europe, would people take a look at you and know that you were American military, or?
Yeah, pretty much. I always remember I stopped in a like a little cafeteria in Cologne once, and I sat at a table by myself, but it was fairly crowded, and pretty soon there were a bunch of people at the table, and I was listening to them talk, and I said a couple of things, and then somebody said something to me, and in German I said to him, "Please don't speak so quickly. I'm an American, and my German isn't that good." And they all went ding, because they didn't know there was an American sitting at the table. So that was kind of, I felt pretty good about that,
Mm-hmm.
that I could hide in there with them, And
Okay. And so what time frame are we talking about? When were you in Bremerhaven?
70 to 72.
Okay. All right. Now, did any sort of echoes of the American anti-war movement or things like that make it over to Germany that you ever observed?
Not that I observed personally. They had some, what was it, the Red Army
Red Brigades.
faction? Some
Yeah, Red Army faction at some point. Yeah, the Red
down
Brigades is Italy, but yeah,
down
Red Army.
in Frankfurt and
Yeah.
stuff. And so when you went through checkpoints or whatever, they took like things and checked under your car to make sure there weren't any bombs tied to the bottom of your car and stuff like that. There were some anxious times with that business.
Okay. Now, did you have any kind of unusual alerts or situations or things that happened while you were Bremerhaven that kind of broke up the routine?
No, not really.
Okay.
I had, when I was on watch, at one point, there was we used to listen to all these conversations all over the world. That's what the base in Bremerhaven did. And we got communications that I think Sri Lanka had been, there was a revolution or something, and they took over. Big government change, and so the guy in charge of that communications brought me a message form that was standard policy when there was a
regime change?
unwarranted regime change like that, flash message, and it all looked good to me, and I signed it off, and they sent it, and that flash message goes to the President of the United States. It's kind of it's a tense moment, and then so it went off, and then the next day I got called back in, and the skipper of the base, skipper of the security group, called me in, and he said, before you send a message to the President, you had to give me a call. There wasn't any protocol to do that, so I hadn't, but it was something to consider.
All right. So I guess describe then a little bit more sort of what your functions are, what's happening at that base.
Well, the main thing they did there was You know, I don't know how much of this is classified anymore. Seems like it was so long ago that it shouldn't be classified, but they were listening to Russian communications and trying to figure out what was going on. And they could, when they got certain kinds of communications of a routine nature, they could predict when the Russians were going to like launch an ICBM. So they started paying a lot of attention to all kinds of communications in order to be able to predict what was going on.
Okay. So I guess how would you wind up being the one to send the communication about Sri Lanka to Washington? You'd think there might be a different route that would send that.
Well, you know, if I guess it's if you get the communications and you're supposed to do something with it, that's what you do. But the I was the operations watch officer, so there were like 140 men on watch at any one time, and there was Morse code operations, there were teletype operations, lots of different communications operations going on all the time, 24 hours a day. So every once in a while something would happen.
Okay. All right. Anything else you want to bring in about the time in Bremerhaven beyond that?
No,
Okay.
We managed, my section, the Alpha section, managed to beat the day workers and win the Captain's Cup volleyball championship.
There you go.
And that was a significant achievement because the day workers always won that thing. So.
Okay. Now, when you finish the tour in Bremerhaven, do you still have time left on your enlistment?
No, I was done at that point.
Okay.
I'd served my 5 years and 3 months, and I think I don't know what the term for it, but I was riffed, which means they didn't need me anymore.
Okay. So they take the people at your what rank were you at that time?
A lieutenant.
Okay. And so at that point, so then actually in the drawdown of the size of the armed forces
Right.
as Vietnam was winding down,
Right.
yeah, so a lot of our Army officers lost their rank, and so they're doing that in the Navy to a certain. Now,
Yeah.
now could you have stayed in the Navy at a lower rank, or were you just being,
No, not really. I might have been able to petition for another job or something, and if they, you know, but I'd have to figure that out.
Okay.
I was kind of ready to move on to something else. So
right.
I thought at that point that going back to school would be a good thing.
Okay. Now, did you opt to stay in the reserves, or did you have a reserve obligation anyway?
No, I opted to stay in the reserves. Went back to school and went to the reserve center and found a job at the reserve center.
Okay. Now, where did you go to school next then?
I went back to the University of Florida, and I got my master's in international management and comparative government.
Okay.
That took about a year, and then during that time I learned a few things about what the best way was to go with a degree. So I thought, you know, maybe I need something a little more productive in terms of what you're going to work for and what I wanted to do. So we moved to Phoenix and went to Thunderbird, international management, international business. It's an international business school.
Okay.
You have a master's degree in international management, get international economics, and I did some German there too, and that took another year in Phoenix. And I was at the reserve center there too, doing my 2 days a month.
Okay. Now, was the government paying for your education at this point?
I was on the, yes.
Okay, so it's sort of the officer's version of the GI Bill, or?
Well, I don't think there's a version,
Okay,
but it was
it's
the
a
GI Bill.
Okay.
Yeah, I was taking advantage of my GI Bill opportunity.
Okay, and you had little kids at home, so was your
Yeah.
wife just taking care of them at that point, or did she get a job
no,
somewhere?
She managed to go to class and do some classes at Thunderbird as well.
Okay.
I don't think she didn't get a degree there, but yeah, those kids were a lot of fun.
All right. Now, having gone and gotten that degree, what did you do with it?
Well, I looked for a job, and I wound up at Baxter Travenol in Chicago. So we moved to Chicago, and I was part of the Baxter Travenol team there.
And what kind of company was that?
Medical products. They made kidney dialyzers was the main thing, and so I got involved in planning the production of kidney dialyzers all over the world, and the amount of kidney dialyzers we would make in the United States and send to different countries like Israel and Japan, and coordinating that activity. It was a very interesting job.
Okay. And then how did you wind up in Michigan?
Well, from Baxter, I got a job at Stryker down in Kalamazoo, and then I moved from Stryker. I moved up to Amway Corporation, and I did Germany and Switzerland distributors for Amway.
Okay. To think back to the military career a little bit, how would you characterize the morale in the Navy units you served with?
Pretty good, pretty good. The Navy had a lot of opportunities, and I think a lot of people took advantage of them, and I think the Navy was pretty good service. For me it was, and I think most people were pretty positive about it.
Okay. Now, I'm not sure to what extent you'd even sort of get to know the enlisted men, but I mean, the Navy was a place where a lot of people enlisted to stay out of the Army or the Marine Corps. Did you have a sense that some of the crew or the enlisted men you were working with were people who were there because there was a draft on?
You know, there might have been a little bit of that. I think people that got into the Navy or were in the Navy felt like they were probably a little better off than having gone to Vietnam and serving in country that was pretty hazardous. I had a fraternity brother, and before I joined the Navy, we talked about being buddies and joining the Navy together. And then I kind of lucked out and went to the Officer Candidate School route, and he went in with the Marines, and he became a corpsman with the Marines.
Okay.
And then he went in country in Vietnam, and I got several letters from him. You know, the letters would come from Vietnam. Somehow they'd go to the United States and come back to the ship. So it was before cell phones, you know. And he would tell me about his adventures, what he was doing, and it made your heart pound to read those letters. And he was I think he was fortunate to live through it. I'm sure he saved a lot of lives, and was a great person to have on patrol as a corpsman. And then he since has had a distinguished career since he left the Navy, left the Marines.
Okay.
Well, actually, he was never in the Marines.
Yeah, he's a Navy corpsman who served with the Marines.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, because the Marines don't have.
And now when I read those things, you know, it's kind of a double thing. You know, you wonder, wow, man, this guy's really doing something good. He's contributing. He's but on the other hand, wow, is that dangerous? It's war can be tough.
Okay. Now, did you notice any kind of racial tensions or issues on the big ships or on the bases?
Not that I recall. Not that I recall. There were, you know, people from different ethnic groups, and it seems like the Navy was pretty good about assimilating. When I was in Bremerhaven, Admiral Zumwalt came out with his what they called Z-grams, which I think tried to get people to talk about things and open up. And so on the mid-watch, I kind of instituted a rap sessions. And with the chief's permission, of course, we would get a few people that had a little bit of extra time and get together and talk about problems and what could be done about them. And you know, I always believed in a sense of participation and being able to speak your problems out and talking about them as being the first part of getting things resolved. So we kept talking, and that was you know, I don't know where the Navy is with that kind of stuff today, but that was a little bit new back then.
Okay. I mean, I ask the questions in part because there's certain stereotypes about the U.S. military, especially in the Vietnam era, and they can have to do with morale, they can have to do with race. And the other issue that comes up is drug use. I mean, was that noticeable at all in the Navy, or?
No, I didn't notice any drug use.
Yeah.
Did not.
Yeah, and it really would be probably hard to have a whole lot of that on the ships like that.
Right, right. I think there were, you heard stories about some people having problems with alcoholism. And, you know, on a ship, alcohol is in the U.S. Navy is strictly prohibited.
Right.
But that didn't mean that some people didn't keep bottles in their bottom desk drawer. But I never saw anybody that had that kind of misbehavior.
Yeah. All right. So for you, how do you think that your time in the Navy affected you, or what did you take out of it?
Well, I loved the Navy. I had a good time in the Navy, and I did my job the best I could, and I think I contributed to the success of our missions and my different assignments. And I look back on the Navy as having been a very, very wonderful experience.
Okay. And how long did you stay in the reserves?
Well, I retired in like 1995, so
Okay.
I think I had about a total of 28 years in.
All right. And what rank did you finish at?
I retired a commander.
Okay. Now, aside.
05.
Okay. And then aside from the sort of 2 days a week, 2 days a month kind of thing, a reserve service, did you have any other longer stints of training of any kind, or summer trips, or?
Sure. We did our 2 weeks every summer, or at least once a year. You were supposed to do 2 weeks, and I had some good. I was the commanding officer of the Naval Station Guam out of Muskegon, Michigan. It was a great unit, great people, and we went. I had active duty for training. We went to Guam for 17 days, and that was an interesting experience. My job there was to inventory the fire engines on the island. The chief, the fire chief, was retiring, and that's one of the things they had to do was check out all the fire engines. So my wife and I, we rented a car, and during those 17 days, we didn't have a very, not a very pressure schedule. We'd just drive around and we'd find one of these fire stations, and just kind of come in on them without them knowing about it. That made it more interesting. And I'd show them my papers and say I'm inventorying the fire engine. Well, they get the stock numbers are right on the painted on the side. I think you'd check it off on the list. Then you go sit down with those guys, and they'd tell you about their fire station and what they were doing and where the best food was close by. They were always good at that. So it was an interesting 17 days on Guam, and some other good activity. But probably the most interesting ones I did were to the Pentagon. I was attached. I was a reserve unit attached to the Pentagon, Deputy Chief of Naval Operations, and it was on the Ring 4, and those people were the people at the Pentagon were doing some pretty interesting stuff. For a while they were working on the U.S. maritime strategy, and gosh, they had some great guys working on it, trying to figure out what the best way was to confront the Russians if they came out of the baffles, and so they put together this strategy that I think helped end the Cold War, really. And we had to do research into lots of different libraries there at the Pentagon, and that was kind of interesting to see. I spent some time looking at the minutes from the Chief of Staff, Joint Chief of Staff meetings at the Pentagon, and Ronald Reagan was in there, and reading these things, it's like, wow, this is interesting history,
Mm-hmm.
and putting that, and then he would ask me questions like, did you see anything about how he felt about the Soviet Union? Did he? I want more quotes about the evil empire,
Mm-hmm.
you know, stuff like that. So.
All right. Now, when the Gulf War happened, did that have any ripple effects where you were?
Not really. Some people got more involved than I did. I know we had to go through sensitivity training. There was a lot of that going on where we had to be correct in our performance with other people, and that kind of got pushed up there.
Okay. And then at that point, is that in dealing with women or people of different races, or?
I think mostly with women.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now, did you see a
The
lot?
Navy started bringing women into more of the action roles, and
Mm-hmm.
so
So did you have women in your unit at Bremerhaven, for instance, or
no.
were there some on the base there that were not in your unit, or?
I don't believe so.
Okay.
I don't believe so. It was actually an Army base
Mm-hmm.
with a little Navy unit.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so you're kind of a very specialized
Mm-hmm.
group there. Okay. But in the reserve units then, were you getting more women coming into those?
Yes, yes. Yeah, and there's always, you know, jokes, but you don't tell jokes because jokes lead to bad feelings.
Mm-hmm.
So,
that was some of the sensitivity training?
yes.
Okay. All right. I mean, as far as you could tell, I mean, did some of the women have a hard time adjusting, or did people not treat them very well, or?
You know, I think it's hard for women to come into an all men's situation, and it takes some strength of character.
Mm-hmm.
And fortunately, a lot of them have pretty strong characters, and that's good. As a society, I think it's wonderful to have the female brain as part of our society, like Israel, you know, and respect that
Mm-hmm.
that contribution to society. So, you know, I think it's got to be hard on a ship. You know, I never really have experienced official duty aboard on a deployment or something like that with women as part of the operation. But it seems to be working.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the exception proves the rule. Every once in a while, there's some kind of a scandal here, a
Yeah.
scandal there. But gosh, I think the Navy's done a really good job assimilating women into the service.
Well, it significantly increases the talent pool.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And in modern warfare now, so much of it is technical anyway.
That's right.
It's your
right.
physical strength is less of an issue.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right, Jim.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Let's see. Now, you had made a set of notes and so forth before coming in here. Do you think there's anything that you were going to talk about that you've left out?
Gosh, I can't really.
Well, we'll take a look.
I think we talked about a lot of good stuff. Not really. I think we pretty much covered everything. It's
Oh, I guess you.
my son is in the reserves now, and so the Navy continues.
All right. Well, and then I'd like to close this by thanking you for taking the time to come and share the story today.
Sure, Jim. It was fun.